Before we begin, take just a moment to subscribe. These stories survive only because people like you choose to listen. Every subscription keeps forgotten history from being buried again. In the lowlands of Mississippi, where the river bends slowly and the land stays wet even in summer, there once stood a plantation that followed a rule no one ever wrote down. It wasn't carved into wood. It wasn't spoken aloud during meetings. And it was never enforced with whips or chains. Yet everyone obeyed it, not because they were ordered to, but because they were afraid. The plantation was called Hawthorne Bend, a stretch of land surrounded by cypress trees and thick fog that rose every morning like breath from the earth itself. From the outside, it looked no different from the others that dotted Mississippi in the 1840s. A large white house sat on slightly higher ground. Slave quarters were arranged in careful rows. Cotton fields stretched endlessly toward the tree line. But Hawthorne Bend had something no other plantation in the county did. Silence, not the normal quiet of early mornings or late evenings, but a silence that felt deliberate, heavy, as if the land itself was holding something back. People who visited noticed it immediately. Horses grew restless near the main house. Guests spoke in lower voices, without realizing why. Even the owners, the Hawthorne family, avoided certain areas of their own land, and all of it traced back to one rule, a rule that applied to everyone: enslaved people, overseers, visitors, and even the family who owned the plantation. There was a place on Hawthorne Bend where no one was allowed to linger, no one was allowed to ask questions, and no one was ever allowed to enter. The rule had no name, but it had consequences. The enslaved people learned about it first, not through words, but through absence, through the way others suddenly disappeared from daily routines, through fields that remained unworked for days because no one would step too close to a certain tree line. At the far edge of the property, beyond the last cotton rows, stood an older structure. It had been there before the Hawthorne family bought the land. Older than the main house. Older, some said, than the plantation itself. It didn't look important. Just a low wooden building, half sunk into ground, its boards darkened by decades of moisture and rot. No windows. One narrow door reinforced with iron bands that had rusted into the wood, as if they had grown there. The enslaved people were told only one thing: stay away. No explanation followed. At first, the rule seemed simple enough. Plantations were full of forbidden spaces, storage sheds, private rooms, offices. But this was different. Overseers who enforced discipline elsewhere would not go near that building. Even the most brutal among them stopped short of its shadow. And that was when fear began to spread. Because fear is not taught, it's observed. An enslaved man named Elijah was among the first to notice patterns others ignored. He had been born on another plantation and sold south as a boy. By the time he arrived at Hawthorne Bend, he had learned to read people more carefully than land. Elijah noticed that on certain mornings, the air around forbidden structure felt colder, that birds avoided the nearby trees, that dogs refused to follow scents leading toward it. But more than that, he noticed how people behaved after being near it. Once, a young overseer new to the plantation, unfamiliar with its unspoken rules, walked too close while inspecting the fields. He laughed when someone warned him, said there was nothing to fear from an old shed. He took 5 steps past the invisible boundary. That night, he didn't come back to the main house. By morning, his horse was found tied neatly to a post near the stables. His coat was folded on a bench. No blood, no signs of struggle, and no body. No one searched. Not because they didn't care, but because the Hawthorne family said nothing. And when the owners remained silent, everyone else followed. From that day on, the rule became absolute. Children were warned not to run in that direction. Field hands adjusted their rows to curve away from the structure. Even during storms, when shelter mattered more than rules, no one crossed the line. What terrified people most was not what they believed was inside. It was that no one seemed willing to confirm or deny anything at all. The Hawthorne patriarch, Thomas Hawthorne, was not a man known for superstition. He prided himself on order, schedules, records. Every pound of cotton was logged, every purchase carefully written down. But there was no mention of the structure in any ledger. It simply did not exist on paper. His wife, Margaret Hawthorne, avoided looking toward it from the porch. When guests asked about the far edge of the land, she'd change the subject or excuse herself entirely. And the children, raised to inherit the plantation, were taught early that curiosity had limits. One evening, during supper, the youngest son asked why the fields didn't extend farther. The room went still. Thomas Hawthorne placed his fork down slowly and said only this: "Some rules are older than ownership." That was the last time the question was asked. As years passed, the rule hardened into instinct. People didn't need reminders. Fear took care of that. Fear passed quietly from person to person, reinforced by disappearances, by sudden changes in routine, by the way even the powerful seem cautious. But fear, like silence, always creates pressure, and pressure demands release. By the late 1840s, something began to change at Hawthorne Bend. The rule remained, but its weight grew heavier. People whispered more often. They watched the forbidden structure more closely, even as they avoided it, because something had begun to happen, something that suggested the rule wasn't just about keeping people out. It might have been about keeping something in, and not everyone was willing to stay silent forever. By the time the rule had existed for more than a decade, no one at Hawthorne Bend remembered when it had begun. That, more than anything, unsettled the people who lived there. Rules without origins were dangerous. They meant something had happened once, something so final that no explanation was ever needed again. The enslaved people whispered that the structure had not always been sealed. Old Samuel, who had worked the land longer than anyone else still alive, claimed that when he was young, the door had been opened exactly once. No one knew why. Samuel spoke rarely, and when he did, people listened. He had survived 3 owners, 2 sales, and 1 failed escape attempt. He had seen punishments worse than death and kindness rarer than mercy. One evening, while repairing tools near the quarters, Samuel spoke in a voice barely louder than the wind. "It wasn't always locked," he said. The others froze. He didn't look at them as he continued. His eyes stayed fixed on his hands. There was a time when they let someone go inside. No one asked who. No one asked what happened, because everyone already felt the answer settling in their chest. Samuel said the person had been a woman, young, newly arrived, sold south after her previous plantation collapsed. She had been brought to Hawthorne Bend because the owners believed she was strong enough for field work. She didn't know, Samuel said, didn't know the rule. The woman had wandered too far while gathering water. When she reached the structure, she stopped, not because she was told to, but because she sensed something wrong. Samuel said she stood there for a long time, staring at the door, and then she touched it. An overseer saw her hand on the iron banding and shouted, not in anger, but in fear. The Hawthorne family was summoned immediately. What followed was not punishment. It was something worse. The woman was taken inside. Samuel didn't know how long she stayed there. Hours, maybe longer. No one watched the door. No one guarded it. They simply waited. When it opened again, the woman came out on her own. She was alive. But Samuel said she was not the same. Her eyes did not focus. Her steps were unsteady. She did not speak. Not that day, not the next, not ever again. She worked for another 6 months, silent and distant, until one morning she simply did not wake up. No marks were found on her body. No wounds. The Hawthorne family ordered her buried at the far edge of the land, away from the others. After that, the door was sealed, permanently. No more warnings were needed. The rule became absolute. What frightened people was not just what Samuel said, but what he refused to say. He would not describe the inside of the structure. He would not repeat what the woman might have told him. When pressed, Samuel shook his head. "Some things don't belong in words," he said. As the years passed, the Hawthorne plantation continued to operate efficiently on the surface. Cotton yields were steady. The family's wealth grew. Outsiders praised their discipline and order. But fear does not stay contained forever. It leaks, and at Hawthorne Bend, it began to leak through behavior. People avoided eye contact when the forbidden area was mentioned. Overseers assigned patrols that curved unnaturally around that part of the land. Children, both enslaved and free, develop a habit of counting their steps when walking near the tree line, as if distance itself offered protection. Then came the Ledger incident. In 1849, Thomas Hawthorne ordered a complete inventory of the plantation's records. He wanted everything reorganized: births, deaths, purchases, sales. Efficiency mattered to him more than comfort. A clerk named Edwin Price was hired to assist. He was young, educated, and unfamiliar with plantation customs. He treated records as neutral facts, not as things shaped by fear. While reviewing older ledgers, Edwin noticed something strange. There were gaps, entire months with no entries for labor assignments near the eastern boundary, names that appeared once and were never mentioned again, supplies that disappeared from records without explanation. When he asked about it, no one answered. So Edwin did what educated men often do when silence confronts them. He kept digging. Late one night, while copying record by candlelight, Edwin noticed a folded page tucked between two older documents. It was not a ledger entry. It was a note, written in a different hand, older, shakier. It described a structure built before the Hawthornes arrived. A containment space. The note called it a place meant to hold something until a decision could be made. The note ended abruptly. No explanation followed. Edwin brought the page to Thomas Hawthorne. The next morning, that was a mistake. For the first time in his life, Edwin saw fear on the plantation owner's face. Not anger, not irritation, fear. Thomas Hawthorne took the page, read it once, then burned in the fireplace without a word. He told Edwin to forget what he had seen. When Edwin pressed, politely, professionally, Thomas dismissed him from the plantation that same day. Edwin never reached the town. His belongings were found at a crossroads 2 miles away. No one claimed responsibility. No one investigated. The rule had claimed another presence, not through force, but through silence. After that, even the Hawthorne family began to change. Margaret Hawthorne stopped hosting guests. The children slept with doors locked. The eldest son refused to inherit the eastern fields, insisting they be sold or abandoned. But land remembers. And so do people. The enslaved community began to sense that the rule was not just about the structure itself, but about what it represented: control, containment, and the fear of something that could not be erased. Because whatever was sealed inside that room had outlived owners, overseers, and records. And now, after years of obedience, something was stirring again. Something that did not respect the rule. Something that would soon force everyone at Hawthorne Bend to confront what they had tried so hard to forget. Fear can hold people in place for years, sometimes for generations. But fear also sharpens awareness. It teaches people to notice patterns, to sense shifts long before they are visible. At Hawthorne Bend, the shift began quietly. It started with animals. Horses that once refused to go near the eastern boundary began stopping on their own, ears twitching, eyes fixed on nothing visible. Dogs stopped barking at night, then stopped sleeping altogether. Birds abandoned the trees closest to the sealed structure, leaving the branches bare even in spring. The land itself felt altered. Those who worked the field spoke of a heaviness in the soil near the forbidden area. Cotton planted too close grew unevenly. Some stalks stunted, others unnaturally tall. Overseers blamed weather. The enslaved people knew better. Something was pressing outward. The rule had always been enforced through absence and silence. But now silence felt strained, as if it were being pulled thin. Elijah noticed it most in people. Those who passed near the boundary, by accident or necessity, returned unsettled, not frightened in the obvious way, but distracted. They forgot simple tasks. They stopped speaking mid-sentence. Some complained of hearing sounds at night that did not belong to wind or animals. No one said the word voice, but everyone thought it. The Hawthorne family sensed a change too. Thomas Hawthorne began riding the property lines more frequently, as if movement could restore order. He spoke less at meals. He stopped writing in the ledgers altogether, leaving entire weeks blank. Margaret Hawthorne began praying in the evenings, not in the parlor where guests might see, but alone in her room with the door locked. She prayed for silence, for containment, for things to remain as they were. The eldest son, William, argue for action. "We can't pretend it isn't there," he said one night. "Whatever was sealed is not staying sealed." Thomas responded sharply. "The rule exists because action failed." That was the closest anyone came to acknowledging the past. But rules that rely on fear alone eventually face resistance, not from courage, but from necessity. That necessity arrived in the form of sickness. In the summer of 1851, a fever spread through the quarters. It was not unusual. Illness visited plantations often, carried by heat and water and exhaustion. But this fever behaved differently. It lingered. It returned. Those who recovered complained of lingering weakness and confusion. The well closest to the eastern fields was suspected. That well stood near the forbidden structure. For the first time in decades, the rule came into conflict with survival. The overseers argued among themselves. Closing the well meant longer walks in brutal heat. Leaving it open meant risking sickness. Thomas Hawthorne refused to give a direct order. Silence again. So the decision fell downward. A small group of enslaved men volunteered to test a water source farther east, beyond the usual boundary. They said little about their reasons, but everyone understood. If the land was already changing, the rule might already be broken. They approached the structure together, careful not to look directly at it. Up close, it felt larger than it appeared from a distance. The wood was darker, smoother in places, as if touched often, despite the years of avoidance. The iron bands were warm to the touch, even in shade. One man, Caleb, noticed scratches on the door. Not old ones. Fresh. Marks that curved and overlapped, as if something had pressed against the wood repeatedly. They retreated immediately. That night, the sounds began. Low at first, almost indistinguishable from settling timber. Then rhythmic. Then deliberate. A presence pressing against a boundary. People lay awake, listening. No one slept. By morning, Thomas Hawthorne could no longer deny what was happening. He ordered the overseers to guard the area, not to approach it, but to watch, to report movement, to keep order. It was a hollow gesture. Guards reported nothing, but they returned pale, shaken, unwilling to remain alone near the boundary for long. One claimed the structure looked closer than it had before. Another swore the door was no longer fully sealed. William Hawthorne confronted his father. "We can't keep pretending," he said. "If something is inside, it's not staying there quietly." Thomas said nothing, because he knew. The truth Thomas Hawthorne carried was not about violence or punishment. It was about containment that had failed from the start. The structure had not been built to punish. It had been built to hold something that could not be destroyed without consequences no one wanted to face. Years earlier, before Thomas inherited the land, a decision had been made to seal away a problem rather than resolve it. The rule was meant to protect the living from the cost of that choice. But costs do not disappear. They accumulate. On the seventh night after the guard were posted, the door changed. Not visibly, not dramatically. It simply did not feel closed anymore. Elijah stood at the edge of the fields and understood, without seeing anything, that the boundary had shifted. The rule, once absolute, now felt like a suggestion. People sensed it all at once. Fear surged, not sharp and paralyzing, but urgent, the kind that demands action. A meeting was held in secret among the enslaved community. No overseers, no owners, just whispered decisions and shared understanding. If the rule was breaking, they needed to know why, not out of curiosity, but to survive what came next. They chose one person, not the strongest, not the bravest, but the one who had listened longest. Elijah. He did not want the role. He understood the risk. He had lived long enough to know that some knowledge changes nothing and destroys those who carry it. But he also knew that waiting would be worse. Before dawn, while fog still covered the ground like a shroud, Elijah walked alone toward a forbidden structure. No one followed. No one stopped him. The door stood before him, silent and unmoving. For the first time in decades, the rule was about to be broken by choice. And whatever waited on the other side had been waiting a very long time. Elijah placed his hand on the iron-banded door and felt it immediately. Not heat, not cold, but resistance, as if the structure itself was aware of him. The wood did not vibrate. It did not move. It simply waited. He did not knock. Knocking implied permission. Instead, he pushed. The door opened with surprising ease, releasing a breath of air that smelled old, not decay, but of something preserved too long. The kind of air that had not moved freely in years. Inside, the space was smaller than expected. No chains lined the walls. No instruments. No signs of violence. That alone unsettled Elijah more than any obvious horror would have. The room was clean. Carefully so. The floor had been swept recently. The walls bore marks, but not scratches, notations, tallies, careful carvings arranged in rows. Names, dates, a record. At the center of the room stood a figure, not restrained, not confined by force. Standing, waiting. The man, if he could still be called that, looked older than time and younger than memory. His posture was upright, deliberate. His eyes focused immediately on Elijah, sharp with recognition rather than surprise. "You're late," the man said calmly. Elijah did not speak. He could not, because the voice was not threatening. It was relieved. The man explained without being asked. Decades earlier, before the Hawthorns owned the land, the plantation had belonged to a family obsessed with order. They believed chaos could be managed if isolated, if removed, if sealed away. The man had not been chosen at random. He had been intelligent, persuasive, someone who spoke too well, someone whose words unsettled both enslaved and free alike. He questioned systems, inspired disobedience, not through violence, but through understanding. The owners feared him more than rebellion, so they contained him, not as punishment, but as a solution. They told themselves it was temporary. The structure was meant to hold him until they decided what to do next. But decisions postponed become permanent. Years passed. Ownership changed. The rule remained. The man did not age normally, not because of magic, but because isolation had preserved him in a way no one anticipated. Time passed differently when days were marked only by silence and memory. The Hawthorns knew. Thomas Hawthorne had inherited not just land, but responsibility. The rule was never about keeping people out. It was about keeping him in, because releasing him meant releasing truth. The tallies on the wall recorded the cost of silence. Each name represented someone who had come too close, someone who had listened too carefully, someone the man had spoken through the door over the years. Words, once heard, could not be contained. Elijah finally found his voice. "What happens now?" he asked. The man smiled sadly. "That depends on how much longer they believe fear can do their work." Outside, the plantation stirred. People felt it the moment the rule fully collapsed. Thomas Hawthorne stood on the porch, staring toward the eastern boundary, knowing without seeing that the door was open. He did not order anyone to stop what was happening, because he knew it was too late. Elijah stepped back into the morning light alone. The door remained open behind him. He did not tell anyone what he had seen, not in detail. He did not need to. The effect was immediate. People felt lighter, more alert, less afraid. Within weeks, the Hawthorne plantation began to unravel, not through violence, but through awareness. Work slowed, questions spread, records stopped making sense. William Hawthorne left first. Margaret followed. Thomas remained until the end, walking the property in silence, watching control slip away without a single confrontation. The structure was dismantled piece by piece. Nothing was found inside. No body, no chains, no proof. Just empty space and walls covered in names that no longer needed to be hidden. Hawthorne Bend was abandoned within the decade. Nature reclaimed the fields. The house collapsed. The land returned to the river. But the rule did not disappear. It transformed. It became a warning passed quietly through stories and silence. Not about a locked room, but about the danger of believing fear is stronger than truth, because fear can seal a door for years. But truth only needs one person willing to open it, and once opened, it does not go back inside.